So I think everybody who is here so far is connected. So good evening, everybody. Welcome to History Happy Hour. My name is Rob Williams, and I serve as Director of Outreach here at Seminary Ridge. And for those who may not have joined us in the past, we began these History Happy Hours last year as a way to directly connect with supporters during times in which we otherwise would not have been able. We paused this year throughout the summer when we were able to resume our annual sunset walking tours, but decided to continue doing these throughout the colder months when there generally aren't as many in-person opportunities. Our next History Happy Hour will be on, I believe, December 17th, followed by one in January and one in February. The working dates are the third Friday of each month, but we will communicate all of those as soon as they are solidified and determined. One person who is missing this evening, Pete Mealy, our executive director, asked me to pass along his regrets that he's unable to attend this evening. He is currently on the other side of town at the Majestic Theater attending the annual Fortinball lecture, which is held each dedication day in honor of the Gettysburg Address. This brings me to our present topic, Abraham Lincoln's connections to the seminary. What an appropriate topic for the date. We knew when we wanted to do it on this evening that it was the perfect topic to do. So tonight we are joined by Director of Education and Museum Operations, Codie Eash, who has been with the museum since its opening in 2013, as well as Education and Visitor Services Coordinator, Kaleb Kusmierczyk. Kaleb has been with Seminary Ridge in various capacities since 2018, and if you have recently taken a cupola tour in the building, it is quite likely that Kaleb was your tour guide. So for the duration of the evening, if anybody has any questions, please feel free to put them in the comments. If you would like to unmute yourselves and ask a question, you're welcome to do that. You can send them in an email on Facebook. You can, you can send a pigeon if you would like. So any kind of questions that you have, we'll make sure that they are conveyed by the end of the evening. We'll make sure to allow some time for that. Originally, we looked at this as sort of an open forum, a conversational style thing. So if anybody does have any questions or wants to chat or talk, we are certainly welcome you and encourage you to do so. But all of the introductions aside, I'm going to turn things over to Codie and Kaleb and mute myself so they can be far more interesting than I am.
You're interesting to us, Rob. So, well, thank you, Rob, for the introduction, and welcome everyone. It is wonderful to be here. This is the first time that Kaleb and I have been part of this series, and so it's wonderful to be part of it, to be with you all this evening. Basically, how we're going to do this is we're going to do the first part in just kind of a general discussion between Kaleb and I, present some of the connections between Abraham Lincoln and the Gettysburg Seminary, both the obvious ones in terms of when he's in Gettysburg on November 18th and 158 years ago today, the 19th, 1863, but also some of the personal connections to seminary students, seminary graduates, connections to the Lincoln assassination and its aftermath and the trial of the conspirators, and even one personal connection with us this evening. And so, we're just going to kind of tell some stories, and we have some images to go along with them. We hope to make this an enjoyable, entertaining, fun evening. Certainly a serious topic, but something that we hope will be entertaining for you all. We have drinks in hand, and I'm wearing my Lincoln socks for the occasion. So we are really happy to have you with us this evening. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here. And where we'll begin is not, if I can advance, there we go, is not with a direct connection, but with a coincidence. A student of the seminary in the years just before the Civil War. This man would study at the seminary in 1859 and 1860, and his name is Abraham Lincoln Gus. And he was born in 1834. This is 4 years before the Abraham Lincoln would rise to any sort of real prominence in Illinois or on a national stage with his Young Men's Lyceum address at Springfield, Illinois in 1838. So he is not named for the eventual president, but rather for his father, Abraham Gus. And he graduated from Pennsylvania College in 1859, entered the Gettysburg Seminary that fall, and would graduate and be ordained as a Lutheran minister the following year, just 1 year before the Civil War. Interestingly, unlike so many graduates of the Lutheran Seminary, he was only a pastor for 2 years. His main career would be as a newspaper editor, as an author, as an historian, as a genealogist, as a biographer. And he also spent a 6-year tenure, interestingly, with the United States Treasury Department from 1879 to 1885. But one other kind of fascinating coincidence between this man named Abraham Lincoln and the Gettysburg Seminary is that from 1865 to 1872, for 7 years after the Civil War, he was the principal in Huntington County at the Cassville Soldiers Orphan School. And in 1866, when these orphan schools, a year after the Civil War, are really kind of getting off the ground, there's going to be a delegation of 10 principals of these schools who goes to Philadelphia. And Abraham Lincoln Gus is one of them. And another of these 10 men is none other than Lieutenant Colonel George McFarland, the former commanding officer of the 151st Pennsylvania Volunteers, which suffered nearly 75% losses on July 1st, 1863, in the backyard of the Lutheran Seminary. And McFarland himself would be hospitalized in the seminary hospital for about 2.5 months and be its final patient to leave. And so we must wonder, what were the conversations like between this man, Abraham Lincoln Gus, who, by the way, went by A.L. Gus for a majority of his life. We might wonder whether he was tired of being questioned as to whether he was named for the president, or as Pete Mealy and I were talking the other day, he said maybe he just voted for the other guy, didn't want to be associated with Lincoln. But nevertheless, kind of a couple of interesting coincidences there, not least of which is that as Kaleb and I were preparing for this, Kaleb mentioned to me that I have a dog named Gus. And so Abraham Lincoln Gus, not to be confused with my 6-year-old English Bulldog Gus, who did not enjoy posing for his shot there as Lincoln with the Gettysburg Address. But I digress. To talk a bit about our more specific connections between Abraham Lincoln and the seminary, we have to go to the days after the battle. July 12th, 1863, Lincoln is going to become aware, perhaps, of the seminary hospital. And this will occur through a series of correspondence that all deal with Confederate General Isaac Trimble, who, of course, as I'm sure many of you are aware, enters the battle as a supernumerary in the 2nd Corps, Richard Ewell's Confederate Corps, really without a command. But ultimately, through attrition, through casualties, he will rise to command a division in what we know today most famously as Pickett's Charge, or the Pickett-Pettigrew Trimble Assault. And he's wounded in that attack on July 3rd, and he'll be hospitalized initially at the McCurdy House next to Christ Lutheran Church on Chambersburg Street. And on July 6th, he's going to have a leg amputated. And he would say in his diary that I was treated with the most tender kindness for 2 weeks when I was removed by orders, to the seminary hospital. Now, his presence at these hospitals, at the McCurdy House and eventually at the seminary, would draw the attention of each of the other men pictured there. We have Major General Robert Schenck, who commanded the department that is headquartered of the United States Army in Baltimore and is overseeing the movement of Confederate captured and wounded in the aftermath of the battle. And he's overseeing the process of moving these men to official United States military hospitals. And he would see that General Trimble was from Baltimore, and he feared what bringing him to Baltimore might mean in terms of his attempts to escape. And so Edwin Stanton, Secretary of War in the Lincoln administration, would become involved, and ultimately President Lincoln himself would be. And you can see a couple of dispatches that are sent there. Lincoln sends to General Schenck on July 12th, "You seem to misunderstand the nature of the objection to General Trimble's going to Baltimore." And Schenck is going to respond. And these messages are occurring, by the way, interestingly, by cipher. One of the stories we love to tell here on Seminary Ridge is that of Signal Corps communication and cipher and secret communications. And that is how Lincoln is corresponding with General Schenck on July 12th. And Schenck tells Lincoln that Trimble has constantly been favored with opportunities at Gettysburg, which he could not have had here, meaning at Baltimore. And ultimately, Trimble is going to be, after some back and forth between the upper echelon of the United States military, he'll be moved on August 20th out of the Seminary hospital, where he had been for several weeks, to Baltimore, and he will be moved to Fort McHenry. He doesn't escape, but interesting that Lincoln's first connection, first awareness perhaps of the Seminary hospital will occur because of a Confederate soldier who was proving rather problematic. Now, around these days in the aftermath of the battle, in the days leading up to the dedication of the Soldiers National Cemetery 4.5 months after, one important thing to reflect upon is what was the condition at the seminary? 3 days of battle had raged around the seminary directly on July 1st, but artillery fire and wounded soldiers in the days and months that followed in the case of the hospital. And this would, of course, wreak a lot of havoc upon the seminary itself. Students and faculty would talk about the building, as one student said, looked like it went through a nutmeg grater. Windows are destroyed. The northeast gable corner has to be replaced. Samuel Schmucker, the president of the seminary, his home is destroyed. And on November 9th, just 10 days in advance of the dedication of the cemetery, his son Beale was interested in visiting his father for the dedication of the cemetery. And Schmucker will tell him this in part in his note back. We are all enjoying good health and looking forward with interest to the great opening consecration of the National Cemetery. But he specifies that his house had been destroyed by Confederate forces from South Carolina. And he says, we are beginning to get fixed in our house yet, as the rebels in our own hospital took 4 of our beds and never returned them. Our ability to accommodate our friends is much abridged. And the physical landscape to the buildings, to the natural vicinity of the seminary would be destroyed for days, months, years, even decades to come. Joseph Newton Brown, the former colonel of the 14th South Carolina, he would describe this landscape when he returned in 1882, 19 years after the battle, by saying that the trees in the seminary grounds where the Union lines ran are still thickly covered with scars from the ground to the height of a man, made with the bullets of our unerring rifles. And so this gives us a sense when Lincoln is visiting Gettysburg, the dead are being buried, the cemetery is being dedicated, but the natural and physical landscape on places of this battlefield that Lincoln would perhaps visit the next day after he came to Gettysburg, the morning of November 19th, this is what this landscape looks like. Kaleb, do you have anything to add before I move on about the seminary campus?
No, I think you're good.
All right, so now we can look at what exactly is Lincoln going to do when he gets to Gettysburg, and how does the seminary fit into this story? On your left-hand side is a handwritten note dated November 17th, the day before Lincoln would depart for Gettysburg, and this is written by Secretary of War Stanton. And Stanton tells Lincoln that the plan was to essentially leave Washington, D.C. on the morning of November 19th, a Thursday, at 6:00 a.m. They would arrive at Baltimore at 8:00 a.m., and then Gettysburg at 12:00 noon. Stanton said this would give 2 hours to view the ground before the dedication ceremonies commence, and then to leave Gettysburg that same evening at 6:00 and arrive back in Washington around midnight. He said, quote, thus doing it all in one day. And Lincoln will reply, as you can see on your right-hand side there, with a great use of technology, the A. Lincoln font, which you can download online, and it's based upon the second draft of the Gettysburg Address. You can type in Lincoln's handwriting. He would reply to Stanton, I do not like this arrangement. I do not wish to go so that by the slightest accident we fail entirely, and at the best, the whole to be a mere breathless running of the gauntlet. Lincoln wants to visit Gettysburg more. He wants to see the battlefield. He wants to understand the place about which he has written these passionate words that will now soon be known to the nation and to the world. And Lincoln will, of course, arrive on November 18th. Lincoln wins the argument. He gets here the evening before. And we can see, using the famous civil engineer S.G. Elliott's burial map, the portion that focuses upon this area that Lincoln seems to have kind of focused his attention on between the night of November 18th and the morning of the 19th. The Gettysburg train station would be the northernmost point that you can see circled there on Carlisle Street. Moving down Carlisle Street to the Central Diamond, as it was then known, Lincoln Square today, to the southeast corner at the home of David and Catherine Wills. And then that evening, apparently conferring with Secretary of State William Seward in the Harper House next door, owned by Robert Harper, who was Gettysburg's postmaster for a time and would become its editor of the Star and Sentinel, a Republican paper in the aftermath of the war. They will confer about a possible battlefield visit the next morning, and we'll talk more about that momentarily. But Lincoln, from the Will's house, from an upper story window, some accounts say, others say that it happens from inside the door facing the square, he will deliver a small brief address, and there are going to be some seminary students who are there to hear him. And I think, Caleb, you have a couple of things to say on that.
Yeah, so there are several students that witness this kind of pre-Gettysburg Address, if you will, right? It's not a formal speech. It's very kind of last minute. These people, I mean, the air of excitement that must have been in Gettysburg leading up to the president coming here for such a less than pleasant visit, right? He's not coming here just on presidential business. It's to dedicate a cemetery, right? And so these people are all flocking to the square, and there's some really great quotes from seminary students that were in the crowd that night on the 18th. One of them comes from Henry C. Holloway, and he talks about that anticipation of what it felt like to be in town that night. He said that the fact the president was coming to town was quite sufficient to create the liveliest of interest. And then another seminary student, Henry Eister Jacobs, whose father was a professor over at the college at the time. He was a seminary student here at the time of the battle, and obviously will be here at the time of the dedication of the cemetery. He actually recalls all of what Lincoln supposedly says to the large and growing crowd chanting to hear from their president. And he says here in a fairly short quote, he says that the president appears and says, "I appear before you, fellow citizens, to thank you for the compliment. The inference is a fair one that you would hear from me for a while, at least were I to commence to make a speech. I do not appear before you for the purpose of doing so, and for several substantial reasons. The most substantial of these is that I have nothing to say. In my position, it is somewhat important that I should not say foolish things." And then it is reported that a voice in the crowd yells out, quote, "If you can help it." Lincoln supposedly then responds with, quote, It very often happens that the only way to help it is to say nothing at all. Believing that this is my present condition this evening, I must beg you to excuse me from addressing you further." And that comes from Henry Eister Jacobs. So the people, the atmosphere, it's very charged, right? Everybody wants to see their executive chief, right? And hear the words that he surely wants to impart upon them, but he says, not tonight, wait till tomorrow. That's when I will deliver that great fanfare that everybody's looking for. Now, obviously, as we'll get to here in a little bit, some of them seem maybe a little disappointed, but like I said, we'll get there. And then, of course, I think you have one more seminary student that was there as well, Cody.
Yeah, one to touch on, and then another here. So Michael Culver, kind of a fascinating double connection to Lincoln is the fact that he was a college student in the spring and summer of 1863, and by the fall he would attend the seminary. And as you can see, he wrote that he was anxious to see and hear the chief executive. He had spent part of the morning of July 1st, 1863 in the seminary cupola watching the opening hours of the battle with a kind of a throng of students from both the seminary and the college. And so here is a person who has seen the Battle of Gettysburg from a really prominent location used by officers during the battle. And now he will witness the president deliver this pre-Gettysburg address, as you called it, Caleb, that evening before. Another kind of interesting perspective, and one of those students who does seem to be rather disappointed in what he hears that night, is Junius Remensnyder. And he was from Stanton, Virginia. So he is actually one of these cases of a Southern student, but he was a United States veteran. He served in Company B of the 131st Pennsylvania Infantry in 1862 into the spring of 63. And his term of service was up just after the Battle of Chancellorsville in May of 1863. But he was a veteran of the battles of Antietam, Fredericksburg, Chancellorsville, and elsewhere. And he would say this in 1918, quite a while, 55 years after the battle. He remembered that the house, talking about the Will's house, faced the central square. And when the students, of which I was one, learned where the president was staying, the square was thronged and made painfully vocal with college cries. But the students were determined to see the president and have a speech for themselves. Loud and long continued calls brought no response. At last, when our patience was almost exhausted, the president, who had been at dinner, which our turbulence had not permitted him to enjoy in peace, appeared upon the balcony. It's an interesting recollection, considering, to my knowledge, there was not a balcony at the Wills house. There was nothing particularly oratorical in his speech, he said, nor did the students think it very complimentary after their tedious wait. So, with a feeling of disappointment and by no means favorably impressed, we retired from the scene. President Lincoln had correctly sized the situation, and he admits 55 years later, as an older man, that to Lincoln had mattered very little what he said to our thoughtless student body that merely desired to have its curiosity gratified. He would save himself, and we with others could well wait for the morrow. And Henry Holloway, who Kaleb quoted from, says rather eloquently in his account, he says, "That night we saw visions and dreamed dreams of what was in store for the next day." Now, that night at the Lutheran Seminary, the building is going to be used as a hotel of sorts. School was in session, but a correspondent from the Cincinnati Daily Commercial would file a dispatch published 5 days after he stayed at the seminary. This would be on November 23rd, 1863, excuse me. And he said that the hotels were filled, private houses in town taken up. I was fortunate in securing quarters at the Theological Seminary. And he describes the location of the seminary. He describes its use as a hospital. And he mentions that he is going to be given a tour of the seminary building by Emanuel Ziegler, who was the steward, the caretaker of the seminary building, along with his wife, the matron, Mary, and their 5 children who lived with them at the seminary building. And he mentions some of the accoutrements of battle that he sees. He is told the spot where some events took place in terms of the use of the building as a hospital. And then he delivers what is my favorite quotation ever about this building. And if you've been on our walking tours, I've used this before. But he says in reflection that night of November 18th, that 1,000 tales of war and its incidents, which history will not record, but which tradition may preserve, cluster around this building. And for all time to come, we'll make it a celebrated spot for the pilgrim to the battleground. There will be thousands of pilgrims, as he calls them, who visit the seminary and the first day's battlefield and the Gettysburg field overall in these couple of days surrounding the cemetery dedication. And as we will see, one of them is apparently none other than President Lincoln. The other interesting thing that this unnamed correspondent from the Cincinnati Daily Commercial gives us is one of the first great in-depth descriptions of what the view looked like from the seminary cupola. And here we can see a portion of a photograph taken by local photographer William Tipton in 1878, which is a little earlier than the images that we have in our museum gallery from 1885, the panoramic images that I'm sure many or most of you have seen. And looking out toward the National Cemetery to the southeast, this is what that correspondent said that night of November 18th or the morning of the 19th when he went up. He said that perhaps the best general view of the battlefield can be obtained from the cupola of the seminary. And we would agree with him even still to this day. And then he says that facing eastward, we have a fair view of Gettysburg. And further to the south, Cemetery Hill, which would be off sort of to your right in that image that you can see on your screen. He says, from there, we can glean the white tops of marble columns, talking about the new graves in the National Cemetery. And on this side are visible the new made graves in the semicircle surrounding, forming the National Cemetery. So you can see both Evergreen Cemetery and the new National Cemetery. He says then, looking still further to the south, to the somewhat mountainous peak of Round Top, the stars and stripes are given to the morning air. And there was this large flag that you can find in many accounts at the top of Big Round Top for the dedication of the cemetery. And then he says that no visitor to Gettysburg should fail to visit the seminary and view the position. And then on the morning of November 19th, there's a correspondent who simply goes by the pseudonym J.H., which some historians have suggested might have been John Hay, Lincoln's private secretary. Now, Hay had submitted pieces to the Washington Daily Morning Chronicle throughout Lincoln's presidency. And curiously, his diary entry for the trip to Gettysburg is relatively short. But there's this really long article that appears in the Daily Morning Chronicle under that byline, J.H. called The American Necropolis, and it gives in detail one reporter's perspective of the cemetery dedication. And so some historians believe that it's possible that this longer piece might have been written by Hay. And so we might have very kind of firsthand accounts here of Lincoln's time in Gettysburg. And one of the interesting lines that comes from this piece, which is published on November 21st, it's about as close as you can get to the event, 2 days afterward. He mentions that former and current governors of Ohio are speaking with one another. And one of them walks up to Secretary of State William Seward. And Governor David Todd says that he had not found Seward at the Harper House, where he was staying next to the Wills House at the square. And then he says this, "Yes, sir," said Seward, "I visited the ground around the seminary this morning." And Mr. Lincoln joined in. And when Lincoln eventually comes back and is lining up for the procession, for the parade of sorts to the National Cemetery, this correspondent, perhaps John Hay, will hear Lincoln remark that he observed he had expected to see more woods. And one might wonder how Lincoln would have had any expectation of what he was going to see. But if we consider the number of photographs, the number of images, drawings that were created around the seminary, around McPherson Ridge, around the first day's battlefield, where perhaps it seems, according to Seward, Lincoln was that morning, he might have been familiar perhaps with what this physical landscape looked like. And maybe when he got there, it just was a little more open than he had anticipated that it would be. There will be really 3 accounts that come out of not necessarily the seminary specifically, but of visiting the battlefield before the National Cemetery dedication overall. With Lincoln would be William Seward, Secretary of State, as we mentioned, saying the ground around the seminary. William McDougall, who was basically the equivalent of the Secretary of State from Canada, and William Tisdale, who was an officer and regimental musician of the 11th New York Cavalry, which was serving as Lincoln's guard unit. William McDougall's account comes from pretty well after the fact. We mentioned Seward's comes from 2 days after, McDougall's comes from nearly a century later, and was based on the reminiscences of Douglas McDougall, who was William's grandson. But in this account, McDougall said, "In the morning after breakfast, the party mounted buckboards," basically wagons, horse-drawn wagons, "and were driven to the battlefield. On the drive, Mr. Lincoln was sullen and absorbed." And then tells this story about how he threw away the speech, wrote it twice, really kind of adds to the mythology, the mythologized version of Lincoln writing this speech on the back of an envelope or on a napkin, which of course, as many of you know, is not the case, but this kind of adds to that mythology. But the interesting takeaway here is that he's not specific about where they went, but he did recall that they visited the battlefield. And similarly, we have an account from William Tisdale, who was a veteran, as I mentioned, of the 11th New York Cavalry. And he had become aware of Lincoln in the early months of his enlistment, when Lincoln had become aware of him in the early months of Tisdale's enlistment. He's serving provost marshal duty in Washington, D.C., and he'll serve as a Lincoln Guard. And as you can see in the rightmost image comes from one of his obituaries with the headline, "Lincoln Aide Dies." And he would wear that distinction that he served as a guard to Lincoln for decades to come. And of Gettysburg specifically, he said that he remembered the Wills House on a corner. There were some tents pitched there. 3 or 4 of us slept in one. It was an officer's wall tent. Lincoln went over the ground on horseback. I went with him. I kept behind in uniform. The horses were from a cavalry regiment. He had a big bay horse, 16 hands high, with a regulation saddle. An officer furnished him with this horse. One of the men furnished mine. He went over the grounds to Pickett's charge, which I've seen nothing else to suggest that that was the case. This interview with an artist named James Kelly was several decades later, so he might be misremembering where they were on the battlefield. And he says debris of the fight was all around. Guns, dead horses. Dead men were found 6 or 7 months after among the rocks and brush, rebels, and our own men. And so 3 accounts, one specific stating that they went to the ground around the seminary, as Seward called it. 2 others from a while after, remembering a battlefield visit. But interesting, nevertheless, to think about the fact that maybe Lincoln went to this ground around the Lutheran Seminary. And why would he have chosen this site? We can only guess. The best assumption of this that I have found is from the book Writing the Gettysburg Address by Martin P. Johnson, published in 2013. And he believed that it's perhaps because the seminary was so close to the site where General John Reynolds died. As the left-wing commander, as a man who was offered command of the Army of the Potomac just a few weeks before his death. And another piece of evidence as to what Lincoln felt about Reynolds was just a couple of weeks later, about a month later, after the visit to Gettysburg, one of Reynolds' sisters, Ellen, otherwise known as Ellie Reynolds, came to Secretary of War Stanton and asked that Charles Vail, a trusted aide to Reynolds, be given a promotion. And Lincoln responded to Stanton, "Please see that this lady, who is a sister to our gallant and brave friend, General Reynolds, who fell at Gettysburg, please oblige her if you can." And Vail is ultimately awarded a promotion. Kaleb, I believe you have some stories from the morning of November 19th at the cemetery involving some seminary affiliated folks.
Yep. So, like I said a little bit ago, when we were discussing the night of the 18th, there were a few seminary students both that witnessed Lincoln the night of the 18th at the Wills house, and then they'll ultimately make their way to the cemetery for the dedication there. And there's some great accounts kind of leading up to that. There's one here that comes from Henry C. Holloway again, and he says that he dreamed of dreams and was excited to see what the next day might hold. And then Michael Clover, again, another seminary student here, who graduated or was at the cemetery during the day for the speech on the 19th. He says, long before the hours of the ceremony arrived, the cemetery grounds were filled with eager spectators. So people, if they weren't in the streets watching the procession, they were already getting their spots at the cemetery, waiting for the dignitaries to arrive there. And of course, we know there's a procession that takes place from going down Baltimore Street and going to the cemetery. And in that procession, not only are there seminary students around kind of in various spots, there's actually some seminary staff and students that will be part of that procession along with President Lincoln making their way down to the cemetery. So they're kind of sprinkled throughout, and that's kind of been the fun part of this project, looking for these different accounts and kind of piecing together all their different stories to kind of build the timeline out here. So, but Holloway also says that he stood not far from the speaker's stand and that he watched before Lincoln got to the cemetery. He says that Lincoln had mounted a rather small horse. He says that after he mounted the horse, Mr. Lincoln's feet were near the ground. The spectacle was humorous, and no one seemed more conscious of this than himself. So here you have this president who's here to do a very important job, right? He's here to dedicate a cemetery, but then there's kind of this humor behind it. He recognizes that he's a larger, taller fellow, and his feet are now dangling off either side of this horse, mere inches off the ground. He recognizes it probably looks rather silly for a president to be in such a compromising position, if you will. And another account here, from the 19th, Henry Eister Jacobs kind of sets the scene. What does the weather look like on the 19th for this dedication? And he says, quote, "The 19th of November was an ideal fall day. There was scarcely a cloud in the sky. The thermometer stood at its maximum at 52 degrees, just warm enough to be slightly bracing. The Army of the Potomac was too much occupied with the enemy to be represented on the occasion by a large number of its troops." So he's talking about the weather here, but also there is some presence of troops, right? There is some detail designated to protecting the president, but there's not perhaps a larger number here due to it still being an active war, right? The war is still going on. There's not peace on the home front as a whole here, right? Everybody still has their sons out on the front lines. And of course, Henry Eister Jacobs will go on to say that he kind of ignores the few guards that are there. He sneaks past them. He said, "I paid no attention to the guards and stood right in front of the platform." So he has a pretty good spot for the speech that will ultimately go down in history as probably one of the greatest addresses ever delivered on American soil. So a great account from Jacobs, and obviously He has quite a few more here that we'll get to. But go ahead, Codie, if you had any more to add there.
Yeah, I just wanted to mention who we're looking at here in the images. For those curious, at the top left of the images, well, first of all, we have the image in the background of Lincoln circled in the center of affairs there. Famous photograph, probably taken as he's finishing the speech. You can see the crowd surrounding him there. But of the seminary related folks, the top row are students. The top left is Junius B. Remen Snyder. The top right is Henry Eister Jacobs. The bottom left is Henry Bauer, who was a graduate of the seminary, and at the time of the battle and the dedication of the cemetery was the president of Pennsylvania College, and he delivered a prayer at the dedication of the cemetery. And at the bottom right there is the Reverend Dr. James Allen Brown. We talk about all the time Samuel Schmucker being the president of the seminary, and that was the case from 1826 until 1864, the year after the battle. Well, it was that man who would succeed Schmucker as president of the seminary. And he was there at the dedication of the cemetery. He had been recently the chaplain of the 87th Pennsylvania. So he is a man who has seen battles of the Civil War. He was the former president as well at a Southern college, at Newberry College in South Carolina. And he's there with a friend and that friend's 9-year-old son at the dedication of the cemetery. And he is someone who will pop back up in our story as pertains to Lincoln here momentarily. The last thing that I'll mention, I'll turn it back to you, Caleb, is that we mentioned the Daily Morning Chronicle, that article that Seward said we went to the ground around the seminary and Mr. Lincoln joined in, that article. That correspondent, again, perhaps John Hay, I think this is rather humorous. He said that during Edward Everett's oration preceding Lincoln's, he said that some idiot in the crowd at once proposed 3 cheers for Everett, which the good sense of the people immediately decided so irreverent upon such an occasion that no one responded, and Mr. Idiot subsided. Turn it back to you, Caleb.
Thank you for that. So the speech, once it's delivered, right, I mentioned a little earlier that perhaps right away it was met with not this standing ovation or this right sense of glee, right, that they just heard the best speech ever, right? There's this idea didn't exist right away. And there's some accounts, again, from these same seminary students that were there. Henry Eister Jacobs, again, he says the suddenness in which he closed was almost startling. The end came when every ear was strained to catch each word. Michael Culver, again, says there was one disappointing feature about it. Its marked brevity. The speaker had, as we thought, but barely commenced when he stopped. The clear, ringing voice ceased before we were ready for it. There was a pause between the close and applause because the people expected more. But when it was apparent that the address was really concluded, the applause was intensely hearty, rising like the sound of many waters. And that came from Henry C. Holloway. Holloway also said, then reflecting later about the speech, he would write, quote, "Indeed, so great was that speech that no one at the time comprehended it fully." So again, it was one of those things that in the moment, you didn't quite fully understand what you may have heard, or because it was so quick, especially following the words of Edward Everett, how brief and concise those words were, but just how powerful they were. It's kind of the epitome of saying what you mean and synthesizing it down into such a fine point that you get your point across, but you do it in such a concise way that it makes it that much better. And it really is kind of the epitome of what a great address or speech should be when you think on kind of the larger level of delivering addresses and such. So once the speech ends, or the Gettysburg Address as we know it ends, it's rather abrupt, but then also is met with a hearty cheer as well. And then after the speech, there's a benediction, which is delivered again by another seminary connection here, by Reverend Dr. Henry L. Bauer. And he was the president over at the college at the time. He graduates from this seminary in 1831. And he actually has a personal connection to the seminary, not the cemetery that Lincoln himself was dedicating at the time, but just next to the National Cemetery is Evergreen Cemetery. And perhaps no one understands the sacrifice of the men who were being laid to rest in that cemetery more than Reverend Dr. Bauer, because his son, Lieutenant Alexander Nesbitt Brooks Bauer, was killed earlier in the war in 1862 at the Battle of Shiloh in Tennessee. It said that he was wounded at least 7 times before he would later succumb to his wounds. So to imagine the feelings that a father, that somebody speaking to dedicate a cemetery where his son, who died in the very same conflict as those men who were now being placed in the same ground that he was dedicating. I can't imagine. That's a hard sense of feeling to put yourself in those shoes, what he was feeling being a part of that ceremony that day. So again, another connection back here to the seminary, and certainly something that is rather unique. You know, a father who knew the price of war perhaps better than anyone else. And I think it's a great way to kind of start to lead towards the ending of this, because although we mentioned earlier the excitement of Lincoln coming to Gettysburg, the crowds coming to see their president, it's that very tangible reminder that this was not just a joyous occasion. They were here to dedicate a cemetery for those who died fighting for their country. And so who better to speak at that dedication and deliver that benediction than a father who was now missing his son because of this conflict.
Now, another man who was on that stage on November 19th was Pennsylvania Governor Andrew Curtin. And Andrew Curtin has a connection to a fallen soldier of Gettysburg who died at the seminary. Kaleb, do you want to briefly tell that connection?
Sure, yeah. So the gentleman's picture there on the left side, his name is Andrew Gregg Tucker, and the gentleman on the right is the wartime governor of Pennsylvania, Andrew Gregg Curtin. So they share a middle name there, and they are both they're actually cousins. And Tucker is a lieutenant in the 142nd Pennsylvania, wounded at Gettysburg on July 1st, treated in the seminary building, and will ultimately succumb to his injuries here, and will be buried initially for a brief time here on the seminary campus before his body is retrieved by his family and reinterred near the family home. But again, another connection. So Curtin on the stage, standing near President Lincoln. It's reported that he was with Lincoln for a lot of this trip to Gettysburg, and so another kind of tangible connection back here to the seminary.
Okay. My slide will not advance. There we go. So we'll move toward a conclusion by just talking very briefly, and then we want to leave some time for questions on Lincoln's non-Gettysburg Address seminary connections. Lincoln, of course, would be the first assassinated president in American history, and his death would come coincidentally on Easter weekend, 1865, leaving really kind of bountiful quantities of biblical material for people to interpret his death on Easter Sunday in their sermons. And one of those sermons would be delivered right here in Gettysburg. Every church has a sermon on this matter in Gettysburg. And as you can see from this article appearing in the Adams Sentinel a few days later, it mentions that in Christ Lutheran Church, oftentimes called the College Church because of the number of seminary and Pennsylvania college students who attended there, Reverend Dr. Brown, who, as I mentioned, was at the cemetery dedication, was the president of the seminary who succeeded Schmucker. It says that he preached an able and eloquent discourse based upon Isaiah chapter 24, verse 11. All joy is darkened, the mirth of the land is gone. And it mentions that he will also speak from the book of Jeremiah, how is the strong staff broken? And so here we have another person connected to the seminary who witnessed Lincoln speak, and now a couple of years later is speaking himself upon the legacy of that now martyred president. Another interesting seminary connection comes to us from the staff of Major General John Hartranft, He is the man seated at the center with the saber in his hand there. And he was in the aftermath of the Civil War, after the assassination of Lincoln and the beginning of the trial of the conspirators involved in the assassination, the commanding officer of the old Capitol Prison in Washington, D.C. And he'll be appointed special provost marshal during that assassination trial of the conspirators. And one of his hand-chosen people is the man circled, standing at the left side at the back there. And that man's name is George Washington Frederick. So not only do we have an Abraham Lincoln Gus attending the seminary, but now George Washington Frederick. And George Washington Frederick was none other than a seminary graduate. He actually not yet. He would start attending the seminary that very fall. Graduated from Pennsylvania College in 1865 and started at the seminary in the autumn of 1865. But he had been a veteran of the Civil War from Company A of the 26th Emergency Pennsylvania Militia, famous company in Gettysburg that responds to the crisis of Confederate forces invading Pennsylvania. He was also a member of General Darius Couch's staff as the commanding officer of the Department of the Susquehanna in 1863. And then he also raised Company G later in the war of the 209th Pennsylvania. And he would rise all the way from second lieutenant to lieutenant colonel, when ultimately in May of 1865, about a month after he's brevetted colonel for gallantry at the attacks at Fort Stedman and Sedgwick during the defenses of Petersburg, he's going to be plucked out of the defenses of Petersburg and hand-chosen by General Hartranft to serve on the staff of this conspirator trial. And so we have a direct link here from a student who would start attending the seminary just a few months later, who had witnessed the conspirators in the Lincoln trial, on trial, and then probably witnessed their execution as well. And there's plentiful correspondence in the official records and elsewhere between General Hartranft and Second Corps Commander, Major General Winfield Scott Hancock, when this man is kind of plucked out of this group after he has just served in the defenses of Washington. He's going to be called upon by his country to serve in another capacity, a much darker capacity for its newly fallen president. But he would attend the seminary in 1865 and graduate in 1866, and would spend the remainder of his career as a minister, a bookstore owner, and a book publisher. And an interesting Gettysburg connection as well. I haven't found the exact connection to the family, but his first wife, her name was Lavina Anna Culp. And so he probably marries a member of that famous family of Gettysburg, the Culp family of Culp's Hill fame, perhaps more than any other. And Kaleb is going to conclude our speaking session with a connection of his own here.
Yeah, thanks, Cody. So this picture may look like any typical 19th century family photo here, but it actually is, there's some connection here to Lincoln. But the gentleman there pictured at the top of the stairs, yep, with the red circle now, his name is John Wilt Crowell, and he served in the 201st Pennsylvania Volunteers, Company F, until he musters out in 1865. While he was in Chambersburg, Pennsylvania, he had typhoid fever. Now, John's life perhaps maybe was not that exciting, but through recent genealogical research, I came across that he is my third great-grandfather, and that he was supposedly tasked with being one of President Lincoln's honor guard while he lay in state in the Harrisburg Rotunda in the state capitol here, while President Lincoln's body made its way back for burial in Illinois. So Wilt, I don't know a whole lot more other than that. It's been really hard to do some research on him, but it appears that he will be one of the color or honor guard guarding over the president's body while it lies in state there. So, yeah.
I think an important connection, not just historically to Lincoln and the seminary, but to somebody who is on the campus of the seminary today in the form of you, and has this connection. I must say, Kaleb, that you have a little facial hair there, but your third great grandfather, that's a good beard he had going. And Kaleb has a child on the way, but to match this family of 10 children, it looks like there.
You know, give me another quarantine and this might be that long. I don't know.
Well, that is all the prepared material that we have. We would like to open it up for any questions that folks have.
We do have a couple of questions that came through the chat. The first one, Joe asked if you could reiterate what Seward had written, Codie. You discussed that a little bit earlier.
Certainly. Basically, it goes to a conversation that's overheard by this correspondent, perhaps John Hay, as I mentioned, but a correspondent from the Washington Daily Morning Chronicle on the rostrum, supposedly, of the cemetery dedication. And Seward at that time is talking with Governor David Todd of Ohio. And Todd says that Seward is looking for Seward, Todd is, on the morning of November 19th. And Seward specifies, why, yes, I wasn't there. I was visiting the ground around the seminary, in his words. And he says, Mr. Lincoln joined me. And so from that, we don't exactly know where he went. Does that mean the seminary proper? Does that mean the west side of town? Does that mean McPherson Ridge, Lee headquarters, Chambersburg Pike? It's tough to say, but the ground around the seminary, some room for interpretation there, but that's what he says.
Thank you. Mark had asked a couple-part question. How could anyone hear the speech? There were no microphones. What time of day was the speech given? Did students skip classes to go? And lastly, what day of the week was November 19th, 1863? Something that I looked up and can say that it was a Thursday.
Yeah. It was a Thursday. The fall semester was in session at the seminary as of September 24th. Because there are faculty members there, I have to wonder, I don't know this for a fact, if classes may have been excused for the day, considering this is kind of an event of, other than the battle, I suppose, the event of the century for Gettysburg. And I think, on a side note briefly, that it is something that Gettysburg residents, from students all the way down to children, all the way up to older generations, would latch onto the fact that not only was this their commander-in-chief, but this is one of the rare times he left Washington during the darkest period of the nation's history. And so they felt Lincoln as sort of one of, really one of their own, who walked their streets, talked to their children, visited their battle-scarred properties. I think it was late morning. Something tells me, I don't have this in front of me, but I believe it was 11 o'clock, somewhere thereabouts. Do you know, Caleb, the time of the dedication?
Everything that I saw said around noon. So I would say between 11 and 12 is probably right. Yeah.
Yeah. And on the question of how could anyone hear, there are a couple of seminarians who mention, Henry Jacobs says there was something unusual in the tones of his voice and the mode of his address. So talking about the speaking patterns and the sound. Junius Remond Snyder says that his voice was somewhat rasping and evidently reached the furthest ear of the crowd. So he says it was a raspy voice, but it carried well. But contrary to that, William Tisdale, who was the guard with Lincoln from the 11th New York Cavalry, he says there was not very much applause, and he assumes that it was because there was some not hearing. And so you have accounts, as with so many cases of people all over the place. If you would take the number of people who were at the cemetery, I think it's usually in the ballpark of 15 to 20,000, most historians presume. But if you'd look at the number of people of those who left us accounts who sounded like they were right up to the stage, they could easily hear him, it's probably far fewer than said that they were. Everybody wanted to admit, of course, when the speech became world famous, that they clearly heard him and appreciated what he said, but that was less than likely the case when it actually happened.
Thank you. And Joe also asks, didn't Lincoln visit where Reynolds fell? And also, thanks for giving the temperature.
I've never found anything specifically that said that he visited where Reynolds fell. That is a presumption by, and I think a well-grounded one, by historians like Martin P. Johnson. I think that Gabor Boret mentions that in the Gettysburg Gospel. And I think it stands up as probably a very good reason. Lincoln and Reynolds are very different politically. Reynolds, of course, had declined command. But if you're thinking from Lincoln's perspective, here's a man who sat potentially in your office a month before he died, a man who you looked up to enough to offer him command of the principal army of the Eastern Theater of the Civil War. And then he dies on a battlefield a month later. I think that Lincoln probably felt some obligation to maybe visit that site of the highest ranking officer killed during the battle. And the excerpt that I shared of his note to Edwin Stanton just a month later, he's calling General Reynolds our dear and gallant friend, General Reynolds. So he's clearly still holding Reynolds in high regard when he's interacting with, in that case, Reynolds's sister. So if anybody, if Joe or anyone has anything that specifically puts Lincoln at Reynolds's death site, that would be wonderful. I haven't personally seen it yet, but I know that it's a theory, and I think it's a plausible one.
Thank you. And I think that is all the questions that we have. Does anybody have any other questions? If you would like to unmute yourself, you're welcome to do so, or put it in the chat.
I'm gonna, as if there are any coming in, that's fine. I'm just gonna share my screen to some couple of announcements here.
Yes, perfect. I forgot about that.
As Rob mentioned, our next History Happy Hour will be December 17th. We're going to be talking about Christmas in Gettysburg during the Civil War. And we're going to be joined by special guest Nancy Gudnestad of the Shriver House Museum. We'll have a formal announcement coming soon about our annual symposium, but it will be, we're pleased to say, February 26, 2022, a Saturday. More information coming soon on that. And we are especially proud of the fact that our educator membership program is now available. If you go to seminaryridgeeducation.org, if you are an educator, if you have someone in your family who is an educator, if you have students in your family, others involved in education, we do have some interactive lessons, virtual tours, resources, and other pieces there focused on any number of subjects that we cover in the museum. And this is an ever-growing repository of digital content, from virtual tours to lessons. And on. And we'll be continuing to add to that, especially through the winter months coming up here.
We do have another question that just came in, but I wanted to say that the next History Happy Hour, if you have not been to the Shriver House, the story of the family there, the Shriver family, is an incredibly powerful one, and an especially powerful story at Christmas time. I'm not going to give anything away, and I encourage none of you to look it up. Wait until December and join us. But the story is, I would argue, is as powerful as any. I took my daughter there a couple of years ago, and she took the tour, and it really moved her. So, and she was 6 at the time. So it's a really powerful story, and hopefully everybody can join us. But the reactions that day to the speech by Everett, Susan asks.
Kaleb, do you have anything specific there from seminary students on that?
That's what I was looking up here. If you go first, I'll try to find something here.
Sure, I don't have anything specific from seminary students, but I know that a common trend that we see in those responses to Everett, you have on one hand, the press, which is, I don't want to say favorable or not to Everett, but it's what is focused upon. The Lincoln speech is the afterthought, not in terms of its planning. That's kind of a mythologized piece of this story, but in terms of how it's treated in the press, if you were to open up a newspaper the day or week after the dedication of the cemetery, most of the coverage is about the situation in Gettysburg, maybe Lincoln's presence there, but the speech that was covered was Everett's. The speech that was reprinted was Everett's. Lincoln's speech is relatively, I don't want to say overlooked per se, but it gets its mention, but not word for word. There are many things that go into that. One is the fact that Everett was the keynote orator. That's the big one. The second one is that it was a prepared, written down speech well in advance. Lincoln doesn't finish his address until he's sitting in the bedroom at the Wills house the night of the 18th or the morning of the 19th. He only has, it seems, the first page of the 2-page Gettysburg Address really truly finished when he arrives at Gettysburg. And even then, there appear to be some notes that are added to it, and terms like "under God" are not added to it until he's on the stand. We can look at the printed copies of the address versus those press accounts which do survive. they differ. They don't include the words "under God" in Lincoln's written version, but in most of those press transcripts, it's there. So he might have ad-libbed that. But from the contrary thing to that is that, while Everett gets all the press, in people's reactions to the speech, they, especially the further on you go, they say Lincoln's was too short and Everett's was too long. I think that we look at Everett's speech with a little bit too much, I guess, comedic relief today. We say Lincoln said in 2 minutes what Everett said in 2 hours. That's what Everett himself says. But I think we are too far removed from that 19th century mentality of a 2-hour speech wasn't because he was up there bloviating and liked to hear himself talk. That was typical. Lincoln's speech was far less typical of the 19th century than was Everett's. Everett's 2-hour speech was what people expected to hear when they got to the National Cemetery. And that's why it's covered so much more in the press. Everett as well is not, we oftentimes hear he's the most famous speaker of the day, and that was probably the case. He's up there. But he wasn't just that. He was the former president of Harvard. He was the former governor of Massachusetts. He was a former vice presidential candidate. He was a figure who, to us today, is relatively forgotten outside of delivering the Gettysburg Address. But he's a relatively massive political and social figure in the 19th century. And so all of that is to say, the closer to the event you are, the less press Lincoln gets, the more press Everett gets. The further you get from the event, the more press Lincoln gets, and you get people saying Everett spoke too long.
Yeah, I found just a real quick quote, I guess, from Jacobs, Henry Eyster Jacobs. He said, "But there are reasons why it is almost forgotten. The orator had attempted too much. An open-air address of 1 hour and 57 minutes length could scarcely hold the close attention of thousands, most of whom were standing on the cold ground. Least of all, when a large portion of the address was more sophisticated than oratorical, and numerous classical allusions were lost on the multitude." He also says that the audience was wonderfully patient. This is still referring to Everett's address here. And he says, "But evidence of weariness could not be entirely suppressed, and I took advantage of the moment to find a place directly in front of the platform, where I stood very near to where President Lincoln was seated." So there's one of the seminary students that was there, his kind of take on Everett's address. Now that is published 1919, looks like. So
there you go. Yeah. And that's very typical of something nearly 60 years after is Everett spoke too long. But if you look at one example, just briefly, 1869, Frederick Douglass visits Gettysburg. People pay 50 cents a head. It's just about $10 today. So about a movie ticket today. And Douglass delivers a 2.5-hour speech. And that's what people are paying for. Look at Lincoln's Cooper Union address. It's dozens of pages. The debates with Stephen Douglas, they're dozens of pages. They're hours-long speeches. So the moral of that story is that Edward Everett, his speech at Gettysburg is, regardless of what we think today, far more typical of its time than was Lincoln's.
Thank you. So that concludes the questions. Mark did ask, will the December 17th happy hour be taped? And how can he see it? Yes, we are recording tonight, and we'll be recording the rest of the member Zooms. They will be uploaded to YouTube, though they will be unlisted, and we will link them to our member portal. This one will go up in early December, and then the following one will go up on the member portal in early January. Though, if you email me and you would like to watch it over your Christmas break, I will share the link with you. I'm very happy to do that. Yes, if you are a member, you will certainly have access to that. With that, I would like to thank everybody for your support this year, even though we're not done for the year. Thank you very much for your continued support. Thank you for being here this evening. And thank you to Codie and Kaleb for being a part of this. And I wish everybody a very happy Thanksgiving. We look forward to seeing you in December, and we have a lot of wonderful things planned for 2023. Almost said 2023. I'm getting ahead of myself. 2022, and you'll be hearing about it soon. So thank you all very much, and happy holidays.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.